Thanks to Envato Elements for sponsoring this video. For more information, check the affiliate link in the description. Hello everyone and welcome back to another tutorial. Today, we're going to be experimenting with some particles. The Super Bowl is considered to be one of the most popular events in the world, and even though I don't usually follow American football as they call it, I still watched the halftime show and it was insane. However, that's not what the focus of this video is gonna be. Instead, we're gonna be taking a look at how to recreate this NFL logo animation that can be seen after the show, which I thought looked pretty cool and wouldn't be that complicated to pull off. At first, I did use Trapcode Particular to recreate this effect, which I would say is one of the most powerful particle systems out there, but after completing it, I thought, wait a minute, Particular is a third-party paid tool, so not everyone is going to be able to use this template. So I decided to start from scratch and focus on using only built-in After Effects tools such as the CC Particle World effect and the Echo effect. The project files are going to be available for download on my Gumroad page, so you can pick them apart and use them in your own projects. As of now, all project files are using the pay what you want system, so you can grab anything you want for free while still having the option to support the channel if you'd like to. Also, if you don't want to miss out on upcoming videos, then make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the bell for notifications. And with that said, let's go ahead and get started. I started off by importing the original version, positioned it in the corner and turned it into a guide layer. This way I could use it as reference throughout the creation process. I created a new solid and made sure to set the dimensions to 2300 by 2300 pixels, so when we rotate the layer in a 1920 by 1080 comp, the edges don't show. You'll see exactly why I did this a bit later. I then added the CC Particle World effect and started playing around with the settings. First of all, I set the radius XYZ to 0, so the particles would come out of a single point. Under physics, I set the animation type to cone axes, the gravity to 0, so the particles wouldn't fall down, and under the direction axes, I set the Y to 0 and the Z to -1, so the particles would shoot towards the camera. Think of the direction axes as the base world orientation of the particle system, so you won't have to hassle around with the camera orientation. Although we can quickly create a new camera and orbit around to get a better idea as to how the cone axis works, the extra angle value controls the cone angle, so how much the particles are spread out, and the extra value adds randomness. I set the extra angle to 15 degrees and animated the extra to start at 0 and gradually increase to 0.1 across 2 seconds, so randomness increases over time. I then increased the velocity to roughly match the speed at which the particles were going in the original version. In this case, I set it to 4 and then animated the birth rate to start at 0.1 and increase to 15 across 2 seconds. So again, it matches the original version where there are a few particles at first, but then the entire screen is filled up. Now let's take a look at the particles themselves. Under the particle type, I went with the texture square, which allows us to choose a texture layer to use as a sprite. But we first need to create a sprite. So I created a new white solid with 50 by 50 pixels because that's the maximum size I needed them to be at. I pre-composed it, and with the layer selected, I added a perfect circle mask by double-clicking the ellipse tool. Back in the particles comp, I then chose the sprite comp as the texture layer. The texture square particle type gives us so many possibilities because the custom sprite can be anything we want. Man, I'm gonna be saying particles so many times throughout this tutorial. Now, you may be thinking, why did I use this particle type when I could have just used a pre-existing sphere preset? Well, for one, there isn't a sharp solid circle preset, and also I wanted to be able to give all of these particles random colors, which we'll take a look at a bit later. This is where the echo effect comes in, which is a very interesting effect that allows us to generate instances of the layer at a certain point in time, be it in the future or in the past. Let's set the birth and death size a bit lower so we can better see what's going on. And if we set the echo time to a very small value like -0.003 seconds and increase the number of echoes, you can see that it's taking our particles layer and creating multiple copies of it, each shifted in time by 0.003 seconds. But if we look closely, we can see the gaps between each particle. So based on the velocity speed, which we set to 4, I found that minus 0.0003 was just right in order to have the particles echo in tiny enough increments to give the illusion of a single line. Now we can adjust the number of echoes to determine the line's length, basically. But keep in mind that the higher you go, the more instances are going to be created and the longer it's going to take to render. The final value I used was 3000, but for demonstrating purposes, we'll leave it at 30 for now. At the bottom, you can also choose how you want these instances to blend with each other, so I set it to composite in back, so there wouldn't be any lighting influence. We'll come back to the echo effect later on. Going back to the particle size, I found that 0.01 for the birth size and 0.015 for the death size matches pretty well with the original version, if the longevity of the particles is set to 0.5. The longevity is the particle lifespan, so 0.5 meant that based on the speed they were going at, by the time they reached the edges of the comp, they were already at their death size. I then set the max opacity to 100% and filled up the opacity map by left-clicking and drawing over it because I wanted the particles to pop in and out instantly instead of fading in and out. As for the colors, the particle world effect doesn't have a random colors option like Trapcode Particular does, for example, but going back to the particle type, because we are using a custom sprite, which is white,
I hate when he rhymes.
What we can do is go inside of the particle sprite comp and add the tint effect with both colors set to black, set the amount to tint to 50%, and then add a wiggle expression by alt-clicking and typing in wiggle, open parentheses, some high value like 100, 50, which means it will shift 100 times per second, which is more than enough because our comp is set to 30 frames per second, by a value of up to 50. In other words, seeing as the amount to tint is 50%, then it can go as high as 100 and as low as 0. Now, if we go back to the particles comp, set the color map to origin constant so it grabs the original colors, and under texture time, set it to birth, the particles are now going to be assigned the color the sprite has at the time of which each particle is emitted. So if the sprite is white at say 2 seconds, then the particles generated at the 2-second mark are going to be colored white. And seeing as the luminosity is changing every frame, then we get random colored particles every frame. I say colored, but it's only black and white colors. So to colorize them properly, I created a new solid, pre-composed it, and added a gradient overlay layer style, with the style set to angle, so we get this clockwise gradient going from black to white. Back in the main comp, I added the colorama effect to this gradient layer and set its blending mode to color so the particles layer underneath takes on the colors from the colorama effect. The color wheel and angle gradient is a very cool combo in this case because it makes it very convenient to adjust what color goes where. If there's a red color at the top of the wheel, then the top side is going to be red. However, there is a slight issue. You can see as I move one of the points to one side, the color on the comp is moving towards the opposite side. And to easily fix this, we can either flip the colorization comp horizontally, which is the dirty solution, or we could go inside of the comp and simply reverse the gradient, which is the elegant solution. Now, when we go back and move the points, you can see they are behaving as they should. So I then sampled the colors from the original version until the colors roughly matched. Another option you have is the interpolate palette, which if you turn off, then the transition from one color to the next will be constant, but with it on, the colors will fade between each other. You can also see that in the original version, at the start, the colors are mainly red and blue to represent the Pepsi brand, I guess, since Pepsi was the main sponsor of the halftime show, and then they shift to the full color spectrum. So I added a second colorama effect with mainly red and blue colors, and then animated the blend with the original value to go from 100 to 0%, so we're left with the original colors. We could now go back to the echo effect and increase the number of echoes to 3000, and then decrease the starting intensity to 0.25 so the particles aren't as bright. There's also the decay option, which you can decrease if you want to get faded lines, but that's not going to be necessary in this case. Another thing you could do is duplicate the particles layer, delete the echo effect, and then increase the birth and death size so you get these dots at the tip of the lines for an interesting effect. At this point, the main particles were ready, but if we look at the original version, there are also a few bigger particles that swoop by from time to time, and the particles that go through the logo. First off, I duplicated the comp, set the birth rate to go from 0 to 0.1, so only a few particles emit per second, and then increase the birth and death size to get thicker lines. Get those thick lines. As for the echo, I didn't need it to be as detailed because these would be blurred out after the fact, so I increased the echo time to -0.002 and decreased the number of echoes to 100. We also have to take a look at the particles that fly through the logo, but first we'll see how the logo was set up. I created a 1920 by 1080 comp, imported the NFL logo, pre-composed it so it's easier to swap the logo later on, and turned it into a 3D layer. For some reference while animating, I also imported a still frame which I rendered from the particles comp. I created a one-node camera and animated the logo to go through the camera, while the camera rotates and constantly zooms out over time, so even when the logo settles in its final position, we still have a bit of movement. You can also see why I went with a 2300 by 2300 pixels comp for the particles, so as the camera rotates, we don't see the edges of the layer. If you're wondering why I didn't use a 1920 by 1080 layer and animate the camera normally, because the particle world effect is a 3D effect and we know that from this box icon, so it is gonna react to the camera. Well, the problem is the echo effect. You see, the echo effect takes into account whatever goes on with a layer throughout the timeline, so if there is a rotating camera present in the comp, then we'll end up with these weird spiral lines. It's cool, but it's not what we want. Which means we're gonna have to pre-render the particles elements and then composite them back together. And that's fine because we were gonna do that either way due to the impact the number of echoes have on render times. By the way, that reminded me, if you're interested in learning how to create a spiral zoom animation, then check out this tutorial I made, which also includes a free template. Speaking of pre-rendering, I then went back to the small particles comp, disabled the colorization, and rendered this comp in black and white. I did this so the colors wouldn't be baked in, just in case I would like to manipulate the colors after the fact. I also did the same thing with the big particles comp. Here's another quick tip. Whenever you're about to render projects that are more prone to crashing, don't render them as a video with the QuickTime format, for example, because if After Effects crashes midway, and trust me, there is a chance that it will, especially if you have complex scenes, then the video will be corrupted and you'll have to re-render from scratch. Whereas if you render them as PNG sequences, then even if the render crashes midway, you still have those individual finished images and you only need to re-render from the crashed frame onwards. Once the renders were finished, I then brought them back into their respective comps, copied the camera from the logo animation comp with property links, and pasted it to each of the particles comp. This way, I would only have to worry about manipulating the camera in the logo animation comp, and those changes would automatically reflect across the other comps. I then turned both the rendered layers and the colorama layers into 3D so they would react to the camera, and scale them up just a bit so the edges wouldn't show as the camera is zooming out. Now it was time to start bringing all of these elements together. I created a 1920 by 1080 composite comp, added a black background, brought in the particles and set them both to screen so they would blend with each other. I added a minimax effect on the big particles to expand them a bit more, blurred them out, increased the saturation and turned down the opacity so they wouldn't be as pronounced. Then I created a new adjustment layer for color correction, to which I added a curves and hue saturation effect to make everything pop. I also added a second curves effect to make the center a bit darker, but instead of having it affect the entire comp, I created a feathered circle mask in the center and used that mask to isolate the effect by dropping down the effects, curves 2, compositing options, clicking the plus icon and selecting the mask. This is a quick and easy way to keep everything under one layer instead of having to duplicate the adjustment layer and then masking the adjustment layer itself. Although I did create another black solid and mask the center as well to make it even darker. Now, if we go back to the original version, you can see that when the logo comes in, it is colored dark blue and it isolates the lines inside its contours. This is also why I chose to leave the logo animation inside its own pre-comp, so we could then use it as a matte. So I brought in the logo, used the Luma key effect to key out the bright parts, and then added a fill effect to give the entire logo the color I sampled from the original version. As for the matte, I duplicated the logo, removed all its effects, and disabled it. On the particle layers, I added the set matte effect, set it to take the matte from the logo matte layer, and unchecked stretch matte to fit, since the particles comps are a different resolution, so by default they are going to be stretched in order to fit with our composite comp, but we don't want that. This way the particles are isolated inside of the logo contours, but I did have to animate the invert matte checkbox, so prior to the logo coming in, the mat is inverted and the particles are completely visible. I then added a brightness and contrast effect to both the particle layers, so they brighten up a bit as the logo settles in. Now let's take a look at how I set up the particles that fly through the logo. First of all, I duplicated the small particles comp, adjusted the birth rate to have the particles start emitting at roughly the same time as they do in the original version, and then stop emitting after about 5 seconds. I set the extra angle to 8 so the particles would pass closer to the camera and decrease the number of echoes for shorter lines. You could decrease the extra angle even more, but just be careful not to go too low, because then the particles might fly directly into the camera. I then disabled the camera and colorization so I could render out the raw animation. Once that was done, I imported it back, set it to 3D, and turned the camera and colorization back on. Back in the composite comp, I imported the fly-through particles, and I now had to make it seem as if the particles are coming from behind the center element of the logo, which is the F letter. So I duplicated the logo animation pre-comp, masked out just the F letter, and then in the composite comp, used that as a matte to cut off the fly-through particles so they appear to be coming from behind the F letter. This is very specific to the NFL logo, but whatever logo you may be using, just make sure you mask out only the elements you want to be in front and put them in the logo animation matte comp. I then duplicated the logo, added the CC radial blur effect with a type set to fading zoom, added a curves effect and boosted the alpha to get a solid extrusion, and then animated the amount value to determine the extrusion amount. I used this same technique in the atmospheric title tutorial, which if you haven't already, then do watch it. Plenty of cool tips there as well. For the reflections, I duplicated the small particles layer, added a curves effect to boost the contrast, added a tint effect to take out the saturation a bit, used the set channels effect to determine the alpha based on the luminance, so whatever is dark is going to be transparent, blurred it out, and then used the set matte effect to isolate it to the front side of the logo with 5% opacity, so it's very subtle. A couple more things I did was to put them in reverse, so in the reflection they seem like they are passing the camera and they keep going. And also added a transform effect at the top of the effect stack in order to rotate it 180 degrees for some variation. The reason I used a transform effect and didn't touch the actual rotation on the layer itself is because of the set matte effect. If I rotate the layer, then the set matte effect breaks. I also put in a reflection copy for the extrusion part, but this one was set to 20% opacity with no reversing or rotation adjustments. I then used 3 glow effects on an adjustment layer to get a really smooth glow, some blur on a different adjustment layer with low opacity and a screen blending mode to give the entire scene some bloom, and a glow effect on the fly-through particles so they shine even more. I even added a couple of faded circles at the top and bottom of the comp, just like in the original version, and had them only appear towards the end of the animation. And finally, an adjustment layer on top for some extra contrast and saturation. And that was pretty much all there was to it, but let's go ahead and quickly take a look at how we would go about replacing the logo with a different one, like say Mercedes-Benz. We'll import it inside the logo comp that says replace me, adjust the scale to match the guides, and then add a fill effect to make it completely black. Then we'll create a white solid and double click on the ellipse tool to create a perfect circle and scale it down so it serves as sort of an outline for our logo. We're doing this because of the way we used Luma key effects to key out certain areas of the logo, so this entire logo will be used as a contour to isolate the particles as a matte, but then the white parts will be keyed out and only the black parts will be used for extruding the logo and serve as a matte for reflections. As for the fly-through particles matte comp, we can isolate only the centerpiece with a mask, and this way the particles come flying from behind the centerpiece and on top of the ring piece. We could even use custom text, but the main rule to keep in mind is that the contours of the logo need to be white and everything else needs to be black. Also, don't forget that you can change the camera or logo animation to be whatever you want. Feel free to experiment. The point of these tutorials is not to just show you how to create the NFL logo animation, for example, but to demonstrate how you can mix and match techniques to bring your own ideas to life. And hopefully that has been the case with the tutorials I have made so far. I'm also aware that the Trapcode particular version that I did does look better when it comes to the details, which is understandable just based on the fact that it has a lot more advanced features to play with. But that doesn't mean we can't produce good results by using only the tools that are available within After Effects. Besides, these projects are always a fun challenge and a good reason to sharpen our skills. Alright guys, we finally reached the end of the tutorial, so if you're still around, then thanks for watching and being patient all the way through. I know this template might be a bit more complex to adjust if you're not familiar with After Effects, but I will try to put in some information inside of the project that will guide you. Even then, if you're still not sure about something, then feel free to leave a comment and I'll do my best to help you guys out. Also, remember to download the project files on my Gumroad page, which again are using the pay what you want system, so you can grab anything you want for free while still having the option to support the channel if you'd like to. If you don't want to miss out on upcoming videos, then make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the bell to be notified. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.